The storm had been raging for 3 days straight, turning the quiet streets of Millbrook into rivers of mud and debris. Victoria Chen pressed her face against the rain-streaked window of her downtown apartment, watching the world blur into watercolor, smears of grey and amber streetlight. At 34, she had grown accustomed to solitude, to the predictable rhythm of her life as a freelance graphic designer. Her evenings followed the same pattern: herbal tea, classical music, and the gentle hum of her computer as she lost herself in pixels and color palettes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the storm seemed to be building towards something she couldn't quite name. The knock came at 11:47 p.m. Victoria paused, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. In 3 years of living in this building, no one had ever knocked on her door that late. The sound came again, more urgent this time, accompanied by a voice she almost didn't recognize through the wood and wind. "Victoria? Please, I know you're in there. I saw your light." Victoria's hand trembled as she reached for the deadbolt. The voice belonged to someone from a life she thought she'd left behind completely. Someone who had no business showing up at her door, especially not at this hour, especially not in this storm. She opened the door to find Sarah Martinez standing in the hallway, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered against her skull like seaweed. Water pooled at her feet, creating a small lake on the worn carpeting. But it wasn't Sarah's appearance that made Victoria's breath catch in her throat. It was the bundle in her arms, a tiny form wrapped in what had once been a yellow blanket, now darkened with rain. "Sarah?" Victoria's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What are you doing here?" Sarah's teeth were chattering so violently she could barely speak. Can we come in? Please?" Victoria stepped aside without thinking, her mind struggling to process the scene before her. Sarah Martinez, her college roommate, her former best friend, the woman who had disappeared from her life 5 years ago after a fight that had torn their friendship apart, was standing in her living room, dripping onto her hardwood floors, holding what was unmistakably a baby. "Sit down," Victoria said, her designer instincts kicking in before her emotions could catch up. "I'll get you some towels." She returned from the linen closet to find Sarah perched on the edge of her grey, sectional sofa, still clutching the baby protectively against her chest. The child couldn't have been more than a few months old, Victoria realized, noting the way its tiny fist peeked out from the soggy blanket. "Here." Victoria draped a large bath towel around Sarah's shoulders and offered another for the baby. "How did you even find me?" Sarah accepted the towel, but didn't immediately answer. Instead, she gently unwrapped the baby, revealing a boy with the most startling blue eyes Victoria had ever seen. He wasn't crying, despite being cold and wet. Instead, he gazed up at them with the kind of ancient wisdom that sometimes seemed to inhabit very young children, as if he understood far more about the world than he should. "His name is Daniel," Sarah said finally, her voice steadier now that she was out of the storm. "Danny." Victoria knelt beside the sofa, studying the child's face. There was something familiar about his features, though she couldn't place what. "Sarah, whose baby is this?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge neither woman wanted to cross. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Victoria saw not the stranger who had hurt her 5 years ago, but the girl who had stayed up all night helping her study for organic chemistry, who had held her hair back when she was sick with food poisoning, who had been closer to her than her own sister. "He's not yours," Sarah said, the words tumbling out in a rush, "but he needs you." Victoria sat back on her heels, confusion washing over her like the rain outside. "What do you mean he's not mine? Sarah, I don't understand what's happening here." Sarah shifted the baby to one arm and reached into her soaked jacket pocket, pulling out a waterlogged envelope. I know this is crazy. I know showing up here like this doesn't make any sense, especially after everything that happened between us, but I didn't know where else to go. The envelope bore Victoria's name written in handwriting she didn't recognize. Not Sarah's careful script, but something more masculine, more hurried. Victoria took it with shaking hands, noting how the ink had run in places where the rain had seeped through the paper. "Who wrote this?" she asked. "Marcus," Sarah said quietly. The name hit Victoria like a physical blow. Marcus Hoffman, Sarah's older brother, the one who had been deployed overseas for the past 2 years. The one Victoria had harbored secret feelings for throughout college. Feelings she'd never acted on because of her loyalty to Sarah. The one whose last letter to his sister had mentioned meeting someone special in Germany. Someone he planned to marry when his tour ended. Marcus he's the father? Victoria's voice sounded strange to her own ears. Sarah nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. Victoria, Marcus died 3 weeks ago. The words seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the apartment. Even the storm outside appeared to quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest, a grief she hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. "How?" she managed. "Roadside bomb," Sarah said, her voice mechanical, as if she'd rehearsed the words. "He was coming back from a supply run. The woman he was going to marry, Greta, she died in childbirth 2 months ago. The baby survived. But there was no family on her side, no one who could take him. The military contacted me because I'm Marcus's next of kin, but Victoria..." Sarah's voice broke. "I can't do this. I can't raise a baby. I can barely take care of myself." Victoria looked down at the envelope in her hands, its contents still a mystery. "But why me? Why not your parents? Or..." "Read the letter," Sarah interrupted. "Please, then you'll understand." With trembling fingers, Victoria carefully opened the envelope, trying not to damage the water-stained paper further. Inside was a single sheet, covered in Marcus's familiar handwriting, the same writing she remembered from the notes he used to leave for Sarah when they were in college. "Victoria, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and Sarah has done what I asked her to do. I know this must be confusing and overwhelming. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, especially considering how things ended between you and Sarah. I want you to know that I never forgot our conversations during those late nights in college, when you would stay up helping Sarah with her studies, and we would end up talking about everything and nothing. You always saw the world differently than the rest of us, with more compassion, more hope. You talked about the family you wanted someday, about how love wasn't just about blood relations, but about choosing to care for someone unconditionally. Greta and I talked about you often. She knew about my family back home, about Sarah's struggles with addiction and our parents' inability to provide stability. When we found out about the baby, we made plans, wrote wills, prepared for every contingency except the one that happened, both of us dying before Danny could grow up. I'm not asking you to be his mother, Victoria. I'm asking you to be a chance. You have something my family lacks, the ability to create a stable, loving home. You have the strength to give a child what he needs to thrive. I know this is asking too much. I know you owe me nothing. But Danny deserves more than the chaos that seems to follow our family wherever we go. He deserves someone who will read to him every night, who will teach him to be kind, who will show him that the world can be beautiful despite its darkness. There's a trust fund, everything Greta and I saved, plus my military benefits. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to give him a good start. The paperwork is with my lawyer, James Peterson, in Chicago. Sarah has his contact information. I know I have no right to ask this of you. But if you can find it in your heart to consider it, Danny would be lucky to have you, as his guardian. Please take care of him the way I know you would have taken care of your own, with love and gratitude, Marcus P.S. He likes to be rocked too. Sleep, and he smiles when you sing to him. He's going to be a good kid, Victoria. I can feel it. Victoria read the letter twice before she could trust herself to speak. When she looked up, she found Sarah watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Hope mixed with fear, desperation tempered by something that might have been relief. "Marcus wrote this before he died?" Victoria asked. Sarah nodded. "He gave it to me 6 months ago when Danny was born. He said if anything happened to both him and Greta, I should bring the baby to you. I thought he was being paranoid, you know, planning for something that would never happen." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I told him I could handle it, that he didn't need to involve you. We fought about it, actually. He said, I didn't understand what raising a child required, the consistency, the stability. I was angry because I thought he didn't trust me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Victoria looked down at Danny, who had fallen asleep in Sarah's arms, despite the chaos surrounding him. His tiny chest rose and fell with perfect rhythm, and one small hand had worked its way free of the blanket to curl against his cheek. "Sarah," Victoria said carefully, "Marcus mentions your struggles with addiction. Are you—" "Clean for 8 months, Sarah said quickly, "but barely, and honest. I don't trust myself with a baby. I can barely keep myself together, let alone take care of someone who depends on me completely. Every day is a fight, Victoria, every single day. That's not the environment a child should grow up in." The honesty in Sarah's voice caught Victoria off guard. In college, Sarah had always been the one with the quick comebacks, the easy confidence, the ability to make any situation seem manageable. This vulnerable version of her former friend was someone Victoria had never seen before. "What about your parents?" Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Dad's on his 3rd marriage, and Mom's been living in Florida with some guy she met online. They haven't spoken to each other in 2 years, and neither of them has ever shown any interest in being grandparents. When I called to tell them about Marcus, Mom's first question was whether there would be enough money left over after the funeral expenses to help her with her rent." Victoria stood up and walked to the window, needing space to think. The storm was finally beginning to subside, but the streets were still flooded, creating an island of their small moment in time. Behind her, she could hear Sarah murmuring soft words to the baby, who had started to fuss. "Victoria," Sarah said quietly, "I know what I'm asking is impossible. I know we haven't spoken in 5 years. I know I hurt you. I know I have no right to show up here and turn your life upside down. But Marcus was right about you. You were always the one who knew how to make things better, how to create something beautiful out of nothing." Victoria turned back to face her. "The fight we had was my fault," Sarah said immediately. "I was jealous and scared and said things I didn't mean. I've regretted it every day since." "You accused me of trying to steal Marcus from you," Victoria said, the old wound still tender after all these years. "You said I was manipulative and fake, that I only pretended to care about you so I could get close to him." Sarah's face crumpled. "I was an idiot. I was high half the time back then, paranoid and mean. I could see the way you looked at each other, and instead of being happy that 2 people I cared about might find something good together, I felt threatened. Like if you and Marcus got together, there wouldn't be room for me anymore." Victoria felt tears building behind her eyes. "I never would have done anything. You were my best friend." "I know that now," Sarah said. "I've known it for years. But by the time I got clean enough to think straight, too much time had passed. I didn't know how to apologize for something that big, that cruel." Danny began to cry, a thin wail that seemed to fill the entire apartment. Sarah rocked him gently, but he only cried harder, his tiny face red with distress. "He's hungry," Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. "I have formula in the diaper bag, but it got soaked in the rain. I don't know if it's still good." Victoria felt something shift inside her, an instinct she didn't know she possessed. "Let me see." She took the soggy diaper bag from Sarah and spread its contents on her coffee table. Most of the supplies were salvageable: bottles, diapers, a few changes of clothes that had been protected by plastic bags. The formula was in a sealed container that had kept the water out. "I can make him." "A bottle," Victoria said, surprised by how natural the words felt. "Do you know how much he usually takes?" As she moved around her kitchen, warming the formula and testing its temperature on her wrist, the way she'd seen her sister do with her own children, Victoria found herself thinking about the letter. Marcus had remembered those late-night conversations, the dreams she'd shared about having a family someday. She had always imagined it would happen differently, meeting someone, falling in love, planning for children together. But life rarely followed the scripts people wrote for themselves. She returned to the living room to find Sarah pacing with Danny, who was now crying in earnest. "Here," Victoria said, offering the bottle. Sarah took it gratefully, but when she tried to feed Danny, he turned his head away, his cries growing more desperate. "Sometimes babies can sense when the person feeding them is stressed," Victoria said gently. "May I try?" Sarah hesitated for only a moment before transferring Danny to Victoria's arms. The baby felt impossibly light, impossibly fragile, but also somehow perfect in the way he settled against her shoulder. Victoria had held her nieces and nephews before, but this felt different. This felt like something clicking into place. She offered Danny the bottle, and after a moment's resistance he began to drink, his cries gradually subsiding into contented sucking sounds. "How did you do that?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with wonder. Victoria looked down at Danny's face, peaceful now as he ate. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe he just needed someone who wasn't afraid." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds Danny's quiet feeding and the wind dying down outside. Victoria found herself studying his features more closely, the way his eyebrows were just starting to darken, the perfect curve of his ears, the tiny birthmark on his left temple that looked like a crescent moon. "Sarah," she said finally, "if I were to consider this, and I'm not saying I am, what would that look like practically? I mean, the legal aspects, the logistics." Sarah reached into her jacket pocket again and pulled out another envelope, this one in better condition. Marcus thought of everything. "This has the lawyer's information, copies of the trust fund documents, medical records, birth certificate, everything. The lawyer said it would be a private adoption, completely legal. Marcus and Greta put provisions in their wills naming you as their preferred guardian." Victoria felt overwhelmed by the weight of Marcus's planning, his faith in her ability to rise to this challenge. "How much time do I have to decide?" "Honestly, not much," Sarah admitted. "I've been staying in a motel for the past week, burning through what little money I have. I can't keep Danny in that environment much longer. If you can't take him, I'll have to surrender him to social services tomorrow morning." The thought of Danny in the foster care system made Victoria's chest tighten. She had volunteered with children's organizations in college and knew how overloaded the system was, how even good foster families struggled to provide the individual attention a baby needed. "Can I have tonight to think about it?" Victoria asked. Sarah nodded. "Of course. But Victoria, you should know, I didn't just come here because Marcus asked me to. I came because I believe he was right about you. Watching you with Danny just now, the way you calmed him down, the way you seemed to know exactly what he needed, I think you were meant for this." Victoria looked down at Danny, who had finished his bottle and was now gazing up at her with those impossibly blue eyes. For a moment, she could almost see Marcus in his expression, not in any specific feature, but in the alert, thoughtful way he seemed to be taking in the world around him. "Where will you stay tonight?" Victoria asked. "I'll figure something out," Sarah said, but Victoria could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "Stay here," Victoria said impulsively. "Both of you. You can take my bed and I'll sleep on the couch. It's too late and too wet for you to be wandering around looking for somewhere to go." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. "You don't have to." "I want to," Victoria said, and realized she meant it. "Besides, if I'm going to make this decision, I should spend some time with him. See how we fit together." As Sarah settled into Victoria's guest room with Danny, Victoria found herself lying awake on her couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of a baby in her apartment. Soft rustling, the occasional sniffle, Sarah's gentle humming. The logical part of her mind was screaming warnings. She had no experience raising children. Her life was carefully ordered, structured around her work and her independence. A baby would change everything, her schedule, her priorities, her entire sense of self. She would have to learn about pediatric care, child development, school districts. She would have to baby-proof her apartment, trade her sports car for something with a proper car seat, give up her spontaneous weekend trips and quiet evenings. But another part of her mind, a part she'd been trying to ignore for years, whispered that maybe this was exactly what she'd been waiting for without knowing it. Maybe all those carefully structured evenings had been preparing her for something bigger, something that would require every bit of her organizational skills and creative problem-solving abilities. She thought about Marcus's letter, about his faith in her capacity to love a child who wasn't biologically hers. She thought about Danny's trusting gaze, the way he'd settled so naturally in her arms. She thought about the alternative, Danny growing up in a system that might not recognize his particular needs, might not nurture whatever special qualities Marcus had seen in him. Somewhere around 3 a.m., Danny started crying again. Victoria heard Sarah getting up, heard her trying to soothe him, but the crying continued. After a few minutes, Victoria knocked softly on the guest room door. "Need help?" she asked. Sarah opened the door, looking frazzled. "I think he might need changing, but I'm not very good at it yet. He gets so upset when I try." Victoria took Danny and laid him on the bed, talking to him in a soft, steady voice as she changed his diaper. He stopped crying almost immediately, seeming to focus on her face as she worked. "You're a natural," Sarah said quietly. Victoria looked up at her former friend, seeing the mix of gratitude and sadness in her expression. "Sarah, are you sure about this? Really sure? Because once I make this decision, there's no going back. If I take him, I'm taking him for good. I won't be a temporary solution while you get your life together." Sarah nodded. "I know, and that's what he needs. Someone who will choose him completely, not someone who might change her mind when things get difficult. I love him, Victoria. I love him enough to know that I'm not what's best for him." Victoria picked up Danny and walked to the window, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. The storm had passed completely, leaving the world washed clean and full of possibility. "Tell me about Marcus overseas," she said. "What was he like as a father?" Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile Victoria had seen from her all night. "He was amazing. He sent me pictures every day. Danny sleeping on his chest, Danny trying to grab his dog tags, Danny smiling for the first time. Marcus said he'd never understood what people meant when they talked about unconditional love until Danny was born. He said it was like discovering a new color, something he hadn't known existed. But once he saw it, he couldn't imagine a world without it." Victoria felt something settle in her chest, a decision crystallizing without her conscious awareness. What about Greta? What was she like? Funny, smart, completely devoted to both Marcus and Danny. She was a teacher in Germany, spoke 3 languages. Marcus said she used to sing German lullabies to Danny, and he would fall asleep immediately. She died knowing that Marcus would take care of Danny. But when Marcus died, Sarah's voice trailed off. She never knew about me. She did, actually. Marcus told her about his plan, about asking you to be Danny's guardian if something happened. To both of them. She said she trusted Marcus's judgment, and if he believed you were the right person, then she believed it too. Victoria woke to the sound of laughter, genuine, delighted laughter that seemed to fill every corner of her apartment with warmth. For a moment, she couldn't place the sound, couldn't reconcile it with her usual quiet mornings. Then memory flooded back. Sarah, Danny, the storm, the decision that still hung in the air like morning mist. She found them in her kitchen, Sarah sitting cross-legged on the floor, while Danny lay on a blanket spread across the hardwood. He was reaching for a wooden spoon Sarah was dangling above him, his entire face lit up with joy every time he managed to bat at it with his tiny fists. "Good morning," Victoria said, surprised by how natural the scene looked in her meticulously organized space. Sarah looked up, and Victoria noticed she looked different in the daylight, younger somehow, less burdened. "He's been awake for an hour, just playing. I've never seen him this content." Victoria knelt beside them, studying Danny's animated expressions. In the clear morning light, she could see details she'd missed the night before. The way his left eye had tiny flecks of green mixed with the blue, the perfectly formed curve of his upper lip, the determined set of his jaw when he concentrated. On grabbing the spoon, "Has he always been this alert?" Victoria asked. "Marcus used to say he was an old soul," Sarah replied. "Even when he was brand new, he would just lie there watching everything, like he was trying to figure out how the world worked." Victoria found herself smiling as Danny finally managed to grasp the spoon, immediately bringing it to his mouth. "To explore." "Smart boy," she murmured. "Victoria," Sarah said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Victoria looked up from Danny, noting the serious tone in Sarah's voice. "Are you considering this because you feel sorry for him? Or because you feel like you owe Marcus something? Because if that's why, then maybe we should think of other options." The question caught Victoria off guard. She had expected Sarah to be desperate for her to say yes, not questioning her motivations. "Why are you asking?" "Because Danny deserves better than pity," Sarah said firmly. "He deserves to be wanted for who he is, not taken in because someone felt obligated. I may not be equipped to raise him, but I love him enough to make sure whoever does really wants him." Victoria picked up Danny, who immediately reached for her hair, wrapping tiny fingers around the strands. "Last night, when you handed him to me to feed him, something happened that I can't really explain. It wasn't pity or obligation. It was recognition, maybe. Like I was meeting someone I'd been waiting to meet." Sarah searched Victoria's face. "But you're scared, terrified," Victoria admitted. "I don't know anything about babies. What if I mess this up? What if I'm not cut out for this and realize it when it's too late?" "Can I tell you something Marcus said to me once?" Sarah asked. "When I was about 15 and convinced I was going to ruin everything I touched?" Victoria nodded. "He said that the people who worry about messing up are usually the ones who don't. It's the people who think they have it all figured out who end up causing damage." Danny had managed to work one of Victoria's earrings free and was examining it with intense concentration. Victoria gently extracted it from his grasp, replacing it with a soft toy from the diaper bag. "There's something else," Sarah continued, "something I haven't told you about Marcus's wishes." Victoria felt her stomach tighten. "What?" "He didn't just want you to be Danny's guardian. He wanted you to be his mother, completely. He put language in his will stating that if you agreed to take Danny, he wanted the adoption to be closed, permanent. No visits from me, no confusing custody arrangements. A clean start." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Victoria looked down at Danny, who had discovered his own feet and was attempting to bring his toes to his mouth. How do you feel about that? Victoria asked carefully. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching Danny's determined efforts. Relieved, she said finally, and sad, but mostly relieved. I know myself well enough to know that I would use any opening to stay involved, and that wouldn't be fair to any of us. Danny needs consistency, not someone who drifts in and out of his life depending on whether I'm having a good month or a bad one. Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening that she hadn't realized had been closed. So if I say yes, you would just disappear. I would move back to California, Sarah said. Start over somewhere new. Maybe that's what I need anyway, a place where I'm not surrounded by reminders of all the ways I've failed. The finality of it should have felt overwhelming, but instead, Victoria found it clarifying. This wasn't about sharing responsibility or co-parenting. This was about choosing to become Danny's mother completely, with all the joy and terror that entailed. I need to make some phone calls, Victoria said. The lawyer Marcus mentioned, my own attorney. Maybe a pediatrician to ask. About what Danny needs medically. Sarah's face lit up with hope. Does that mean... It means I need to understand what I'm committing to before I commit to it, Victoria said. But Sarah, looking at him now, holding him, I can't imagine saying no. The next few hours blurred together in a flurry of phone calls and research. James Peterson, Marcus's lawyer in Chicago, walked Victoria through the legal process over the phone, explaining that Marcus and Greta had structured everything to make the transition as smooth as possible. The trust fund was substantial, not wealthy-making money, but enough to ensure Danny's education and basic needs were covered through college. Dr. Angela Torres, a pediatrician recommended by Victoria's own doctor, agreed to see Danny that afternoon for a wellness check. Victoria found herself taking notes like she was preparing for a presentation, writing down questions about feeding schedules, developmental milestones, vaccination schedules. You're approaching this like a project, Sarah observed, watching Victoria create color-coded folders for different aspects of Danny's care. That's how I approach everything, Victoria replied, then paused. Is that bad? Should I be more spontaneous? Sarah laughed. Are you kidding? Do you know how many times I wished I could be more like you in college? You made everything look manageable. You turned chaos into order. Victoria looked up from her notes. You really think I can do this? I think you're the only person I know who would create a filing system before deciding whether to adopt a baby, Sarah said, and honestly, that's exactly what Danny needs. Someone who thinks things through, who plans ahead, who turns love into action. At Dr. Torres's office that afternoon, Victoria found herself answering questions about Danny's medical history as if she'd been doing it for months. The doctor was impressed with his development, noting his alertness and responsiveness. He's clearly been well cared for, Dr. Torres said, finishing her examination while Danny gurgled contentedly on the table. Babies who feel secure tend to be more engaged with their environment. Someone has been doing a good job with him. That was Marcus, Sarah said quietly. Danny's father. He died 3 weeks ago. Dr. Torres's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss. Are you family members deciding on custody? Victoria exchanged glances with Sarah. I'm considering adopting him, Victoria said, but I don't have any experience with babies. What should I know? For the next 30 minutes, Dr. Torres walked Victoria through the basics of infant care, but more importantly, she talked about the emotional aspects of caring for a child who had experienced loss. Even babies this young can sense disruption in their routines, changes in their caregivers, she explained. The fact that he seems so comfortable with you is a very good sign. Trust your instincts. Babies are remarkably resilient when they feel loved and secure. On the drive back to Victoria's apartment, Danny fell asleep in his car seat, one small hand curled around Victoria's finger where she'd reached back to comfort him at a red light. He trusts you, Sarah said. watching the interaction. Victoria felt tears building behind her eyes. "Sarah, I want to say yes. I want to take him home and learn how to be his mother and give him everything Marcus wanted him to have. But I'm scared I'm being naive. What if loving him isn't enough?" "Can I tell you what I learned in recovery?" Sarah asked. "Love isn't a feeling. It's a choice you make every day, sometimes every hour. It's choosing to get up at 3 a.m. when he's crying, choosing to put his needs before your own convenience, choosing to be patient when you're exhausted. And Victoria, you've been making those choices since the moment you opened your door last night." Back at the apartment, Victoria spread all the legal documents across her dining table while Sarah gave Danny a bath in the kitchen sink. The sound of splashing and Sarah's gentle voice singing what Victoria realized was one of the German lullabies Marcus had mentioned created a soundtrack of domesticity that felt both foreign and comforting. The paperwork was straightforward but overwhelming in its implications. Adoption papers, trust fund documentation, medical power of attorney forms. Each signature would represent an irreversible commitment to a child she'd known for less than 24 hours. "Victoria?" Sarah appeared in the doorway, holding Danny wrapped in one of Victoria's fluffy bath towels. "I think he wants you." Victoria looked up to find Danny reaching toward her, his face breaking into what was unmistakably a smile when their eyes met. Without thinking, she pushed back from the table and took him, feeling the warm weight of him settle against her shoulder. "He smells like my lavender soap," she said, breathing in the clean baby scent. "I hope that's okay. It was the only thing I could find that seemed gentle enough." Victoria realized that she liked the idea of Danny carrying her scent, of him smelling like home. It's perfect. As evening approached, Victoria found herself moving through the motions of caring for Danny, as if she'd been doing it for years. She prepared his bottle without having to ask Sarah for instructions, changed his diaper with growing confidence, rocked him to sleep in her reading chair while humming softly. "You're a natural," Sarah said, echoing her words from the night before. But this time Victoria didn't deflect the compliment. "Maybe I am," she said wonderingly. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Victoria sat in her living room with Danny sleeping peacefully in her arms. She studied his face in the soft lamplight, trying to memorize every detail, the way his eyebrows drew together slightly when he dreamed, the perfect shell of his ears, the way his breathing created the tiniest whistle through his nose. For the first time in years, Victoria tried to imagine her future, but instead of seeing herself alone in her carefully organized apartment, she saw something different. She saw herself teaching Danny to walk in this same living room, reading to him in the big chair by the window, helping him with homework at the dining table where legal documents were currently spread. She saw birthday parties and school plays, and driving lessons and college visits. She saw a life that was messier than what she'd planned, but infinitely richer. "Danny," she whispered to the sleeping baby, "what do you think? Should we try this together?" As if in response, Danny's hand found hers and held on tight, even in sleep. Victoria knew then that her decision was made. It had probably been made the moment she'd opened her door to find Sarah and Danny standing in the storm. Everything since then had just been her mind catching up to what her heart had recognized immediately. Tomorrow, she would sign the papers. Tomorrow, she would officially become Daniel Marcus Hoffman Chen's mother. Tomorrow, her real life would begin. But tonight, she simply held her son and listened to him breathe, marveling at how quickly love could transform everything you thought you knew about yourself. Outside, the city hummed with its usual late-night energy, but inside Victoria's apartment, time seemed suspended in the perfect stillness of a mother watching over her sleeping child. In the space of 2 days, Victoria had discovered that family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you chose, something you built with intention and love and the willingness to let your heart grow large enough to hold another person's entire world. Sarah was right. Danny had needed someone who would choose him completely, but what Victoria was only beginning to understand was that she had needed someone to choose as well. In taking care of Danny, she was also taking care of the part of herself that had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this moment. The morning of the adoption signing dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that made Chicago look like a postcard. Victoria had been awake since 5, not from anxiety, but from an electric anticipation that seemed to course through her veins. Today, she would officially become Danny's mother. Sarah was scheduled to fly back to California at 2 in the afternoon. Her flight was booked, her few belongings already packed into the same battered suitcase she'd arrived with 3 days ago. The finality of it should have felt tragic, but instead there was something ceremonial about it, like the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. "Are you ready for this?" Sarah asked, bouncing Danny gently while Victoria prepared his morning bottle. They had fallen into an easy rhythm over the past few days, but Victoria could sense Sarah pulling back emotionally, preparing herself for the separation. "I think so," Victoria replied, testing the formula temperature. "Are you?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying Danny's face. "I keep thinking about what Marcus would say if he could see this. He always believed things worked out the way they were supposed to, even when it didn't seem like it at the time." Victoria took Danny from Sarah's arms, noting how naturally he settled against her now. "Tell me something about Marcus I don't know. Something that will help me understand what kind of man Danny's father was." A smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth. "When we were kids, maybe 7 and 9, we found an injured sparrow in our backyard. Most kids would have either ignored it or poked at it, but Marcus spent the entire day researching how to help it. He made a little nest out of towels, fed it with an eyedropper, sat with it for hours. Our mom thought he was wasting his time, said the bird was probably going to die anyway." Did it survive? Not only did it survive, but Marcus nursed it back to health and taught it to fly again. When it was ready, he released it in the same spot where we'd found it. He said that sometimes the most important thing you can do is give something a chance to become what it was meant to be. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. He was talking about more than the bird, wasn't he? Marcus always saw potential where other people saw problems. That's why he knew you were right for Danny. Not because you were perfect, but because you had the capacity to help Danny become whoever he was meant to be. James Peterson's law office occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise, all gleaming marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered sweeping views of Lake Michigan. Victoria had expected the meeting to feel formal and intimidating, but Peterson turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s who immediately put them at ease. "Marcus spoke about you often," he told Victoria as they settled into his conference room. "He was very specific about what he wanted for Daniel, and very confident that you were the right person to provide it." The actual signing took less than an hour, but each document felt weighty with significance. Guardian ad litem reports. Home. Study waivers that had been expedited due to the unusual circumstances. Trust fund transfers. Name change paperwork that would make Danny officially Daniel Marcus Chen. "There's one more thing," Peterson said as they finished the last signature. He reached into his desk and pulled out a small wooden box. "Marcus asked me to give this to whoever adopted Daniel, but only after the papers were signed." Victoria opened the box to find a simple silver locket on a delicate chain. Inside was a tiny photograph of Marcus in his military uniform on one side, and on the other, a picture of a young woman with Danny's exact eyes and Marcus's smile. "That's Greta," Sarah said softly. "She was beautiful, wasn't she?" Victoria nodded, unable to speak around the sudden tightness in her throat. "Marcus wanted Daniel to have something of both his parents," Peterson explained. He said when Daniel was old enough to understand, he wanted him to know that he was loved by 3 different mothers: Greta, who gave birth to him, you who chose to raise him, and Sarah, who loved him enough to let him go. Sarah made a small sound that was half sob, half laugh. Trust Marcus to find a way to make everyone feel important. Victoria carefully placed the locket back in its box. I'll save this for when Danny's older, when he's ready to hear their story. As they left the law office, Victoria found herself looking at the world differently. Every couple pushing a stroller, every parent holding a child's hand, every family photograph in shop windows. She was part of that now. She belonged to the vast, invisible network of people whose lives revolved around the needs and joys of their children. I should head to the airport soon, Sarah said as they walked back to Victoria's car. Victoria felt a sudden panic. Are you sure about this? Leaving completely? We could figure out some kind of contact, maybe letters or... No, Sarah said firmly. This has to be clean. For all of us. Danny needs to bond with you completely without wondering when his other mother is coming back. And I need to learn how to build a life that isn't centered around crisis management. Back at the apartment, they moved through the final preparations with the efficiency of people determined not to let emotion derail them. Sarah packed the last of Danny's clothes into the new diaper bag Victoria had bought, while Victoria assembled the crib that had been delivered that morning. The instruction manual for this thing is in 3 languages, Victoria muttered, struggling with the complex hardware. Here, let me help, Sarah said, kneeling beside her. Together, they managed to construct Danny's first piece of furniture in his new home. It's perfect, Sarah said, stepping back to admire their work. The crib sat in the corner of Victoria's bedroom, next to the window where morning light would wake Danny gently. Victoria had already hung soft blue curtains and placed a mobile of silver stars above the mattress. Danny, meanwhile, was having what Sarah called tummy time on a blanket spread across Victoria's living room floor, pushing himself up on his arms and surveying his kingdom with the serious expression of a tiny monarch. He's getting stronger every day, Victoria observed, watching him work to lift his head higher. Marcus used to say that from the moment Danny was born, he seemed determined to see everything, to not miss a single detail of the world around him. At 1 o'clock, Sarah's taxi arrived. Victoria had offered to drive her to the airport, but Sarah had declined, saying goodbyes were easier when they were quick and definitive. Standing in the doorway of her apartment, holding Danny, while Sarah gathered her things, Victoria felt the magnitude of what was happening. This woman who had been her closest friend, then her deepest hurt, then a stranger, was about to walk out of her life forever, entrusting her with the most precious thing she had. Sarah, Victoria said, as her former friend picked up her suitcase, I want you to know that I'll tell Danny about you. When he's older, when he asks about his family, I'll make sure he knows that you loved him enough to make this choice. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Tell him I hope he gets Marcus's sense of humor and Greta's intelligence and your kindness. Tell him that he was wanted by more people than most children ever are. She kissed Danny's forehead gently, then surprised Victoria by hugging her tightly. Take care of each other, Sarah whispered, and then she was gone, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Victoria and Danny alone together for the first time as an official family. Victoria closed the door and leaned against it, looking around her apartment with new eyes. Everything was the same furniture, the same carefully chosen artwork, the same plants arranged just so on the window sills. But everything was also completely different, because now it was home to 2 people instead of 1. Well, Danny, she said, carrying him to the window where they could watch the taxi disappear into traffic, it's just us now. As if he understood the significance of the moment, Danny reached up and touched her face with his small hand, his expression serious and thoughtful. That evening, Victoria found herself moving through what she realized were now their bedtime routines, Bath time in the kitchen sink, a bottle while she rocked him in the chair by the window, soft singing until his eyes grew heavy. But tonight felt different from the previous nights, when Sarah had been there to offer guidance and reassurance. Tonight, every decision was Victoria's to make, every choice about Danny's care, his schedule, his needs. It all rested on her shoulders now. The responsibility should have felt overwhelming, but instead it felt right, like stepping into a role she'd been preparing for without knowing it, as she lowered Danny into his new crib for the first time. Victoria was struck by how perfectly he fit into the space they'd created for him. The mobile cast gentle shadows across his face, and the soft nightlight she'd installed provided just enough illumination for her to see his peaceful expression. "Sweet dreams, my love," she whispered, words that felt both new and ancient on her tongue. Victoria had expected to lie awake that first night, hyper-aware of every sound Danny made, but instead she slept more deeply than she had in weeks. When she woke at dawn, it was to the sound of content babbling from the crib. She found Danny wide awake, studying the mobile above his head with intense concentration. "Good morning, sunshine," she said, lifting him out of the crib. "How did you sleep?" Danny responded with what she was learning to recognize as his happy sounds, little coos and gurgles that seemed to express satisfaction with his surroundings. Over the next few days, Victoria discovered the particular rhythm of life with an infant. The way time seemed to both stretch and compress, how an hour could feel like a day when Danny was fussy, but how entire afternoons could disappear while she watched him discover his own hands or listened to him experiment with different sounds. She learned that Danny preferred his bottles slightly warmer than room temperature, that he slept better when she left her bedroom door open so he could hear her moving around the apartment, that he found the sound of her hairdryer absolutely fascinating and would stop crying immediately when she turned it on. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" she told him one afternoon, as he demonstrated his newfound ability to roll from his back to his side. Victoria also discovered changes in herself that surprised her. Her work schedule naturally reorganized itself around Danny's needs. Projects that had once seemed urgent now felt less important than making sure Danny had enough tummy time or that they took their daily walk around the neighborhood. She found herself talking to him constantly, narrating her activities, reading him news articles, explaining the plot of whatever movie was on television. "Some people might think I'm crazy for talking to you like you understand everything," she told him during one of their walks through Lincoln Park. "But I think you're taking it all in, storing it up for when you're ready to use it." 2 weeks after the adoption was finalized, Victoria received an unexpected visitor. She was giving Danny his morning bottle when her building's doorman called to announce that someone named Elena Rodriguez was asking to see her. "I don't know anyone by that name," Victoria told the doorman, shifting Danny to her other arm. "She says she's from Child Protective Services, ma'am. She has identification." Victoria felt her stomach drop. "Send her up." Elena Rodriguez turned out to be a kind-faced woman in her 40s who immediately put Victoria at ease with her warm smile and gentle manner. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced," she said, as Victoria invited her in. "This is just a routine follow-up visit. We do them for all expedited adoptions to make sure everything is going smoothly." Victoria felt herself relax. "Of course. Would you like some coffee?" As Elena conducted her informal interview, asking about Danny's adjustment and Victoria's experience. So far, Victoria realized how much her confidence had grown in just 2 weeks. She answered questions about feeding schedules and sleep patterns with the authority of experience, showed Elena the baby-proof cabinet locks she'd already installed, discussed her plans for childcare when she eventually needed to return to full-time work. "He seems very content," Elena observed, watching Danny play with the soft rattle while lying on his blanket. "Babies who feel secure in their environment tend to be more exploratory, more willing to engage with new people and experiences." "He's an amazing baby," Victoria said, and meant it. Every day he does something new, something that surprises me. And how are you adjusting? This was a significant life change for you. Victoria considered the question seriously. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, and also the most natural. Does that make sense? Like learning a language I somehow already knew, but had never spoken. Eleanor smiled. That makes perfect sense. Some people are natural parents, regardless of whether the children are biological or adopted. You clearly have good instincts. After Elena left, Victoria found herself thinking about the phrase natural parent. She had always assumed that meant people who made parenting look effortless, but now she wondered if it actually meant people who trusted their instincts, who let love guide their decisions rather than fear. That afternoon, she called her sister, Rachel in Portland, someone she'd been meaning to talk to since the adoption, but hadn't quite known how to explain what had happened. You adopted a baby? Rachel's voice was incredulous. Victoria, when? How? You never mentioned wanting children. It's complicated, Victoria said, watching Danny attempt to grab his toes from his bouncy seat. But Rachel, I need you to know that this feels right. More right than anything I've ever done. I can hear it in your voice, Rachel said softly. You sound different, happier. I am happier. I'm also terrified and exhausted and constantly worried I'm doing everything wrong. But underneath all that, I'm happier than I knew was possible. When can we meet him? Victoria smiled, realizing she was looking forward to introducing Danny to his extended family. How about Thanksgiving? You could come here or we could come to you, whatever works better with your schedule. As autumn deepened into winter, Victoria and Danny settled into the natural rhythms of their life together. She learned to read his different cries, to anticipate his needs, to find joy in the smallest milestones. The first time he laughed, the day he managed to sit up unassisted for 30 seconds, the morning she found him awake in his crib, not crying, but simply looking around with quiet contentment. She also learned about the fierce protectiveness that came with loving a child. When strangers in the grocery store commented on his beautiful eyes or asked intrusive questions about his background, Victoria found herself developing diplomatic but firm responses that protected Danny's privacy while satisfying people's curiosity. He's lucky to have you, an elderly woman in their neighborhood coffee shop said one morning, watching Victoria expertly maneuver Danny's stroller while ordering her latte one-handed. Victoria looked down at Danny, who was awake and alert in his stroller, taking in the bustle of the cafe with his usual intense interest. I'm the lucky one, she replied, and realized she had never meant anything more completely. Christmas morning arrived, with the kind of hushed snowfall that transformed Chicago into a winter wonderland. Victoria woke to find Danny already stirring, in his crib, now positioned in what had become his own nursery, the guest room she'd converted over the past month, with soft yellow walls and shelves lined with books she read to him every night. At 8 months old, Danny was becoming a force of nature. He could pull himself up to standing, cruise along furniture with determined concentration, and had recently discovered the joy of dropping things just to watch Victoria pick them up. His personality was emerging more clearly each day. Curious, persistent, surprisingly gentle with his toys, and possessing what Victoria had come to think of as an old soul's patience. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," she whispered, lifting him from his crib. He responded with the babbling that had become his morning greeting, a complex stream of sounds that seemed to contain entire conversations she couldn't quite decode. Victoria had invited Rachel and her family to spend the holiday with them, marking the first time Danny would meet his aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins. She found herself nervous in a way she hadn't expected, not about whether they would like Danny, but about whether they would understand how completely her life had changed, how thoroughly this child had rewrapped her entire sense of self. Rachel arrived at noon with her husband Tom, and their twin daughters, Sophie and Emma, both 6 years old and vibrating with holiday excitement. Victoria watched through her window as they approached the building, Rachel carrying a bag of presents that seemed impossibly large. "He's gorgeous," was the first thing Rachel said when Victoria opened the door, Danny balanced on her hip. "Victoria, he looks just like you described, but somehow more substantial." Tom extended his hand to shake Victoria's, then grinned. "Sorry, that sounded weird. I meant he seems very present, very aware, like he's really taking everything in." The twins were initially shy around Danny, hanging back while the adults talked, but Victoria noticed them watching him with intense fascination as he played with his toys on the living room floor. "Can he walk yet?" Sophie asked eventually, edging closer. "Not quite," Victoria replied, "but he's getting close. He can stand up by holding onto things." As if summoned by their conversation, Danny pulled himself up using the coffee table and stood there swaying slightly, looking enormously proud of his accomplishment. "He's showing off," Emma declared with authority. "My friend's baby brother does that too." Victoria realized this was the first time she'd seen Danny interact with other children, and she was struck by how naturally he seemed to accept their presence. When Sophie tentatively offered him one of her own toys, a small stuffed elephant, Danny examined it carefully before attempting to hand it back to her, creating what Victoria recognized as his version of sharing. "He's incredibly social," Rachel observed, watching the interaction. "You can tell he feels secure. Anxious babies don't engage like that." Over lunch, Victoria found herself telling Rachel and Tom about the daily rhythms of her life with Danny, the way he woke up singing to himself, how he had strong opinions about which books he wanted to read, his fascination with music that led to impromptu dance parties in the kitchen while she cooked dinner. "You sound like you've been doing this for years," Tom said, "not like someone who's been a mom for 3 months. Sometimes it feels like years," Victoria admitted, "and sometimes it feels like yesterday. Time works differently when you're responsible for someone else's entire world." After lunch, while Danny napped and the twins played quietly with their new toys, Rachel and Victoria sat by the window, watching the snow accumulate on the fire escape. "I have to ask," Rachel said carefully, "do you ever miss your old life? Freedom? Spontaneity?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "I miss being able to leave the house in 5 minutes instead of 25, she said finally. "I miss uninterrupted showers and being able to eat a meal while it's still hot. But miss my old life? No. This feels like my real life. Everything. Before Danny feels like I was just practicing." "Mom was worried, you know," Rachel said. "When you told her about the adoption, she was concerned you were being impulsive, that you hadn't thought it through." Victoria smiled. "And now? Now she calls me twice a week, asking for updates about Danny's latest developments. She's already planning his first birthday party." When Danny woke from his nap, he seemed to have decided that Sophie and Emma were his new favorite people. He crawled directly to where they were building a tower with blocks, pulled himself up to standing, using Emma's shoulder for support, and promptly knocked over their construction. Instead of being upset, the twins found this hilarious. "He's like a baby dinosaur," Sophie announced, "destroying cities." "Can we teach him to crawl through the tunnel?" Emma asked, gesturing to a blanket fort they'd constructed between 2 chairs. Victoria watched as her nieces patiently demonstrated crawling techniques, cheering when Danny managed to make it halfway through their tunnel before getting distracted by a toy car that had rolled under the coffee table. "They're naturals with him," Victoria told Rachel. "They've been asking when they can babysit," Rachel replied. "I told them maybe when they're 30. As the afternoon wore on, Victoria realized she was seeing Danny through her family's eyes. For the first time, not as the baby she worried about constantly, but as a charming, engaging little person with his own distinct personality. When he clapped his hands in delight at Tom's silly faces, when he offered Rachel pieces of his finger food during snack time, when he fell asleep in Victoria's arms while she read him a story, Her family saw not just her devotion to him, but his obvious attachment to her. "He adores you," Rachel said quietly as Victoria tucked a sleeping Danny into his crib that evening. "The way he looks at you, the way he settles when you hold him. There's no question who his mother is." Later that night, after Rachel's family had returned to their hotel, Victoria sat in Danny's room watching him sleep and reflecting on the day. For months, she had been so focused on learning how to be Danny's mother that she hadn't considered how he was also learning to be her son. But today, she had seen evidence of their bond from the outside, the way he sought her out when he was tired, how he looked to her for reassurance in new situations, the trust in his eyes when she picked him up. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge. Danny woke up feverish and fussy, clearly not feeling well. Victoria's first instinct was panic. What if it was something serious? What if she couldn't tell the difference between a minor illness and something that required immediate medical attention? But as she took his temperature and assessed his symptoms, Victoria realized her panic was being overridden by a calmer instinct. Danny had been teething for weeks, and his symptoms seemed consistent with what Dr. Torres had described as normal for that process. She gave him appropriate medication, offered extra fluids, and spent the day holding him while he dozed fitfully. "Poor baby," she murmured, rocking him in the chair by his bedroom window. "I know you don't feel good." Danny whimpered and pressed his face against her shoulder, and Victoria felt the particular heartbreak that comes with being unable to take away a child's discomfort. By that evening his fever had broken, and he was showing interest in his toys again, but the experience had been a turning point for Victoria. She had navigated her first real parenting crisis without calling Dr. Torres, without second-guessing every decision, without the paralyzing fear that had characterized her early weeks with Danny. "You handled that like a pro," she told herself, as she prepared Danny's evening bottle. "You trusted your instincts, and they were right." The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of playmates and new routines. Victoria had connected with other parents in her neighborhood, and Danny had begun attending a music class for babies that met twice a week at the local community center. "He has excellent rhythm," the instructor, Ms. Angela, observed during one session, watching Danny bounce enthusiastically to the beat of a children's song. "Some babies are naturally musical, and I think you have one of those." Victoria made a mental note to add music lessons to the growing list of activities she envisioned for Danny's future. Swimming lessons, soccer, maybe piano if his musical inclinations continued to develop. On New Year's Eve, Victoria found herself at home with Danny, having declined several party invitations. A year ago, she would have been out celebrating, staying up until dawn, sleeping until noon the next day. But this year, she couldn't imagine being anywhere other than where she was, reading Danny his bedtime story, listening to the distant sound of fireworks through her windows, feeling perfectly content with the quiet domestic rhythm of their life. "This time last year, I had no idea you existed," she told Danny as she rocked him to sleep. "I had no idea how much my life was about to change." Danny made sleepy sounds against her shoulder, his body growing heavy with approaching sleep. "I hope this year brings you everything you need to grow into whoever you're meant to be," Victoria continued. "I hope I can be the mother you deserve." As January unfolded, Victoria noticed changes in Danny that marked his development in ways that felt both gradual and sudden. His babbling began to include sounds that seemed intentional, attempts at communication that went beyond basic needs. He developed preferences that seemed to indicate emerging personality traits. He preferred books with photographs to books with illustrations. He was fascinated by mechanical objects like can openers and vacuum cleaners. He showed an unusual patience for puzzles and shape-sorting toys. "He's going to be an engineer," Victoria told Dr. Torres during Danny's 9-month checkup, "or a scientist. He takes everything apart to see how it works." "He's definitely a problem solver," Dr. Torres agreed, watching Danny methodically explore the various toys in her examination room. His fine motor skills are excellent for his age, and his focus is remarkable. You're doing something right. Victoria felt a warm glow of pride, not just in Danny's development, but in her own growth as his mother. 9 months ago, she'd been terrified of making mistakes, of not knowing enough, of somehow failing this child who had been entrusted to her care. Now, while she still worried and questioned herself regularly, she also trusted her instincts, recognized her own competence, and felt genuinely confident in her ability to meet Danny's needs. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Dr. Torres said, as the appointment concluded. "Have you thought about his education yet? I know he's only 9 months old, but good early childhood programs often have waiting lists." Victoria realized she had been thinking about Danny's education, though not in formal terms. She had been reading to him since his first week with her, talking to him constantly, exposing him to music and art and nature. But the idea of choosing a preschool, of making decisions that would affect his intellectual development for years to come, felt both exciting and overwhelming. "Any recommendations?" she asked. "There's a wonderful Montessori program about 10 minutes from here," Dr. Torres said. "They focus on following each child's natural curiosity, letting them learn at their own pace. Based on what I see in Danny, that approach might suit his personality well." That evening, Victoria found herself researching educational philosophies online while Danny played at her feet. The idea that she was responsible not just for keeping him safe and healthy, but for nurturing his intellectual growth, for making choices that would shape his relationship with learning, felt momentous. "No pressure, right?" she said to Danny, who looked up from his toys as if he had been following her thoughts. "I just have to figure out how to help you become the best version of yourself." Danny responded by crawling over to her chair and pulling himself up to standing, then reaching toward her laptop keyboard with obvious interest. "Okay, point taken," Victoria laughed, closing the laptop and lifting him into her lap. "One day at a time. We'll figure it out together." As winter deepened into the coldest months of the year, Victoria discovered the particular coziness of being homebound with a baby during a Chicago blizzard. Snow piled against her windows, wind rattled the building, and she and Danny created their own warm world inside, building pillow forts, reading stories, working on simple puzzles that helped develop his hand-eye coordination. "This is what happiness looks like," Victoria realized one afternoon, watching Danny concentrate intensely on fitting wooden shapes into corresponding holes. "Not the dramatic, overwhelming kind of happiness I used to think I wanted, but this quiet, steady contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong." Danny looked up at her and grinned, an expression of pure joy that seemed to light up the entire room, and Victoria felt her heart expand in ways she was still learning to accommodate. Love, she had discovered, wasn't a finite resource. It grew to meet whatever demands were placed on it, stretching and deepening in response to need. "I love you too, sweet boy," she told him, and meant it with every cell in her body. Danny's first birthday arrived on a surprisingly warm March morning, with crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow in Lincoln Park. Victoria woke early, not from Danny's usual cheerful babbling, but from her own anticipation of the milestone they were about to celebrate. 1 year since that stormy night when Sarah had appeared at her door. 1 year since her life had been completely transformed. He found Danny already awake in his crib, standing and bouncing with excitement as if he somehow understood that today was special. At 12 months, he was walking confidently, had a vocabulary of about 6 words that Victoria could actually understand, and possessed an inexhaustible curiosity about everything in his environment. "Happy birthday, my love," Victoria said, lifting him out of his crib. Danny responded by pressing his face against her cheek in what had become his version of giving kisses. The party Victoria had planned was small but meaningful. Rachel's family, Victoria's parents who had flown in from Denver, Dr. Torres and her daughter, and 3 other mothers from Danny's music class with their children. Victoria had spent weeks planning every detail, from the hand-painted decorations to the organic, sugar-free cake she'd learned to make specifically for this occasion. "You know he won't remember any of this, right?" Her mother, Patricia, had pointed out during one of their planning conversations. "I'll remember," Victoria had replied. "And someday, when he asks about his first birthday, I want to be able to tell him that we celebrated how lucky we felt to have him in our lives." Now, as she prepared Danny's special birthday breakfast, scrambled eggs cut into tiny pieces, fresh strawberries, and a mini version of his birthday cake, Victoria reflected on how much had changed since that first terrifying night, when she'd had no idea how to prepare a bottle. Danny sat in his high chair, methodically exploring his breakfast with the scientific approach he applied to everything. He would pick up each piece of food, examine it carefully, taste it thoughtfully, then either eat it with obvious pleasure or place it neatly on the side of his tray for later consideration. "You're going to be a food critic," Victoria told him, watching him deliberate over a piece of strawberry. "Or a chemist. You approach everything like you're conducting an experiment." The doorbell rang at exactly 11, and Victoria found her parents standing in the hallway with arms full of presents and expressions of barely contained excitement. "Where's our birthday boy?" Patricia asked, immediately scanning the apartment for Danny. Danny heard the voices and began bouncing in his high chair, calling out, "Nana, Papa!" words Victoria had been working on with him for weeks in preparation. "For this visit, he knows us," Victoria's father, Robert, said with obvious delight. "Victoria, he actually knows us." What followed was one of the most joyful afternoons Victoria could remember. Danny, who could sometimes be shy with new people, seemed to understand that he was the center of attention and rose to the occasion magnificently. He demonstrated his walking skills by toddling between guests, showed off his ability to stack blocks, and charmed everyone by clapping enthusiastically when they sang "Happy Birthday." "He's remarkable," Dr. Torres said quietly to Victoria as they watched Danny attempt to feed cake to Rachel's twin daughters. Not just developmentally, though he's hitting all his milestones beautifully, but emotionally. He's confident, secure, genuinely happy. That doesn't happen by accident. Victoria felt a flush of pride mixed with gratitude. "I had good instincts to follow. Marcus was right about Danny being special. Marcus was right about you being special, too," Dr. Torres replied. "Some people are natural nurturers, but you've gone beyond that. You've created an environment where Danny feels safe to explore, to take risks, to develop his own personality. That's not easy to do." As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Victoria found herself sitting on the floor with Danny, surrounded by wrapping paper and new toys. He had abandoned most of his presents in favor of playing with the colorful tissue paper, which he found endlessly fascinating. "Simple pleasures," Robert observed, watching his grandson stuff tissue paper into an empty box and then dump it out again with great satisfaction. "Some things never change." "He's just like Victoria was at that age," Patricia added. "More interested in the packaging than the gift. Remember that Christmas when you were 3 and played with the cardboard box for hours instead of the expensive a toy that came in it?" Victoria did remember vaguely, and she felt a warm connection to her younger self through Danny's behavior. Maybe this was how family traditions were born, not through grand gestures, but through these small recognitions of shared traits and tendencies. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Victoria gave Danny a bath and put him to bed in his birthday pajamas. Soft blue cotton, with silver stars that seemed appropriate for a child who reached for everything with such determination. 1. Year, she whispered as she rocked him to sleep. 1 year of being your mama. Can you believe it? Danny made sleepy sounds against her shoulder, and Victoria found herself thinking about Sarah, wondering where she was, whether she ever thought about Danny on significant dates like this. Victoria had kept her promise to tell Danny about the people who had loved him before she came into his life. But so far, those stories were one-sided conversations with a child too young to understand their significance. The week after Danny's birthday brought an unexpected phone call. Victoria was working at her computer while Danny napped when her phone rang, displaying a number she didn't recognize with a California area code. Victoria? This is James Peterson, Marcus's lawyer. Victoria felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't spoken to Peterson since the adoption finalization, and unexpected calls from lawyers rarely brought good news. Is everything all right? She asked. Everything's fine, Peterson said quickly. Actually, I'm calling with some potentially wonderful news. I've been contacted by a colleague who handles estate law in Germany. It seems that Greta's family has been trying to locate Daniel. Victoria felt the world tilt slightly. Greta's family? But I thought there was no family on her side. Apparently, there was some miscommunication during the chaos after Greta's death. She had grandparents, her father's parents, who were traveling in Australia when Greta died. They only learned about Daniel's existence when they returned home and began settling Greta's affairs. Victoria's mind raced. What does this mean? Are they trying to claim custody? No, nothing like that, Peterson assured her. They understand that Daniel has been legally adopted and that his life is settled, but they're hoping to establish some kind of contact. They have photographs, family documents, medical history that might be valuable. They want to make sure Daniel knows about his German heritage. Victoria sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. Can I think about this? It's not something I want to decide quickly. Of course. I'll send you their contact information and some background materials. Take all the time you need. They're not going anywhere. After hanging up, Victoria sat in her quiet apartment, listening to Danny's peaceful breathing through the baby monitor and trying to process this new development. She had always known that someday she would need to help Danny understand his complex family history, but she had imagined having years to prepare for those conversations. Now, suddenly, there were living grandparents who wanted to be part of his story. When Danny woke from his nap, Victoria found herself studying his face with new awareness. He had Greta's eyes, but were there other features she had attributed to Marcus that actually came from the German side of his family? Would these grandparents see their daughter in Danny's expressions, their own family traits in his developing personality? What do you think, sweet boy? She asked Danny as he played with his toys on the living room floor. Are you ready to learn about the other people who love you? Danny looked up at her and grinned, then returned to his serious work of transferring blocks from one container to another, seemingly unaware that his world might be about to expand in ways Victoria was still trying to understand. Over the next few days, Victoria found herself researching Greta's family through the materials Peterson had sent. Klaus and Ingrid Müller were both retired teachers in their 70s, living in a small town outside of Munich. They had raised 3 children, but Greta had been their only daughter, and they had been devastated by her death. The photographs they'd included showed a warm-looking couple surrounded by grandchildren, who bore a striking resemblance to Danny. There was also a letter, written in careful English, that brought tears to Victoria's eyes. Dear Victoria, we hope this letter finds you and our grandson Daniel healthy and happy. We have spent many months trying to find him, not to disrupt his life, but to make sure he knows that he is loved by many people in many countries. Our Greta was a wonderful daughter, and from Marcus's letters, we know she would have been a wonderful mother. We grieve that we will never see her raise her son, but we are grateful that Daniel has found such a loving home with you. We do not wish to complicate your family or confuse Daniel. We only hope that someday, when he is old enough to understand, we might be able to share stories about his mother, to show him photographs of her childhood, to help him understand the family that lives across the ocean and thinks of him with great love. If you are ever willing, we would be honored to meet you and Daniel. We promise to respect whatever boundaries you think are best for his well-being. With gratitude and affection, Klaus and Ingrid Müller-Victoria read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of thoughtfulness and respect. These weren't people trying to claim rights or disrupt Danny's life. They were grandparents who wanted to give him the gift of knowing his full heritage. That evening, Victoria called Rachel to talk through her feelings about the situation. "It sounds like they're being very respectful," Rachel said after Victoria had explained the situation. "And honestly, Victoria, don't you think Danny deserves to know about this part of his family? You've always said you wanted him to understand his whole story." "I know," Victoria said, watching Danny cruise along the coffee table, pulling himself from one end to the other with determined concentration. "It's just that we've built this perfect little world, and I'm scared of disrupting it." "But maybe it's not about disruption," Rachel suggested. "Maybe it's about expansion, adding more love to Danny's life, not replacing what he already has." Victoria knew Rachel was right, but the decision still felt enormous. She had become Danny's mother completely, and part of her felt protective of that role, worried that introducing other family members might somehow diminish the bond they had built. But as she watched Danny play, she remembered Marcus's letter, his hope that Danny would grow up knowing he was loved by many people. Wasn't this exactly what Marcus had envisioned? A child surrounded by love from multiple sources, enriched by connections to his entire heritage. 2 weeks later, Victoria made her decision. She wrote a careful letter to Klaus and Ingrid Müller, explaining that while she needed to move slowly for Danny's sake, she was open to building a relationship that would allow Danny to know about his German family when he was old enough to understand. She also included photographs of Danny playing in the park, reading books, celebrating his first birthday, and a detailed update about his development, his personality, his daily routines. The response came faster than she had expected. Another thoughtful letter, along with a package of children's books in both German and English, hand-knitted sweaters that looked exactly the right size for Danny, and more family photographs that showed Greta as a child bearing an unmistakable resemblance to Danny. "Look," Victoria said to Danny, showing him a photograph of Greta at about his age, sitting in a garden and reaching toward the camera with the same expression of determined curiosity that characterized Danny's approach to the world. "That's your first mama. When she was a little girl just like you." Danny examined the photograph with interest, then reached for it as if he wanted to touch Greta's face. "She would have loved you so much," Victoria continued. "And her mama and papa love you too, even though they live far away." As spring progressed toward summer, Victoria found herself corresponding regularly with the Müllers, sharing updates about Danny's development and learning about Greta's childhood, her interests, her dreams of travel and family. The exchanges felt natural and enriching rather than threatening. Adding depth to the story, Victoria would someday tell Danny about his origins. "You know what I've realized?" Victoria told Dr. Torres during one of Danny's routine checkups. "Love isn't a zero-sum game. The more people who love Danny, the richer his life becomes. It doesn't take anything away from what we have together." "That's very wise," Dr. Torres replied, "and Danny's lucky to have a mother who understands that. Some parents get territorial about their children's affections, but the healthiest children are the ones who feel loved by a wide community of people." Danny, meanwhile, continued to develop at his own remarkable pace. He was saying new words almost daily, showing early signs of the problem-solving abilities Victoria had noticed from the beginning, and demonstrating a social confidence that made him popular at the playground and in his music classes. "He's going to be a leader," one of the other mothers observed, watching Danny organize a group of toddlers in what appeared to be a very serious game involving sand buckets and careful distribution of playground equipment. "Look how the other kids follow his lead." Victoria watched Danny coordinate the complex social dynamics of toddler play with what seemed like natural diplomatic skills. Where did these abilities come from? Were they inherited from Marcus's military leadership experience, from Greta's teaching background, or were they uniquely Danny's own emerging talents? "He's definitely his own person," Victoria said with pride. "Every day I see him becoming more himself." That evening, as Victoria read Danny his bedtime stories, now a collection that included books in German from his grandparents alongside their usual favorites, she reflected on how much her understanding of family had evolved over the past year. Family, she had learned, wasn't just about the people who lived in your house or shared your daily routines. It was about the network of love and connection that surrounded a child, giving him roots in multiple traditions, and the security that came from being claimed by many people who cared about his well-being. "Sweet dreams, my love," Victoria whispered as Danny settled into sleep, surrounded by books in 2 languages, wearing pajamas knitted by grandparents across the ocean, secure in the knowledge that he was cherished by a mother who had chosen him completely. Tomorrow would bring new developments, new challenges, new opportunities for growth. But tonight, Victoria felt peaceful with the choices she had made, confident in the foundation she had built for Danny's future, and grateful for the unexpected ways love had multiplied in their lives. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in late August, while Danny was absorbed in his favorite activity of building elaborate towers with blocks only to knock them down with theatrical delight. Victoria had been working on a logo design for a new client when her phone buzzed with an international number she now recognized. "Victoria." Klaus Müller's voice carried across the ocean with unusual urgency. "I hope I am not calling at a bad on time, but Ingrid and I have some news we wanted to share with you directly." Victoria felt her stomach flutter with concern. Over the past 5 months, their correspondence had settled into a comfortable rhythm of weekly emails and occasional video calls, where Danny would wave at the screen, while Klaus and Ingrid cooed over his latest accomplishments in a mixture of German and English. "Is everything all right?" Victoria asked, automatically lowering her voice even though Danny was too engaged with his blocks to pay attention to her conversation. "Everything is wonderful," Klaus said, and Victoria could hear the smile in his voice. "Ingrid and I have been talking, and we have decided to take a trip to Chicago. We would very much like to meet Daniel in person, if you would be comfortable." With that, Victoria's heart began beating faster. She had known this moment would come eventually, but the reality of it felt both thrilling and terrifying. "When were you thinking?" "We were hoping for October, perhaps for a week or 10 days. We understand this is a big step, and we want to follow your lead completely. If you think it is too soon, we are happy to wait." Victoria looked across the room at Danny, who had successfully built a tower taller than himself and was now standing back to admire his architectural achievement with obvious pride. At 18 months, he was a confident, curious toddler with opinions about everything from which shoes he wanted to wear to which book should be read first at bedtime. "Can I think about it and call you back?" Victoria asked. "Of course," Klaus replied. "Take all the time you need. We just wanted to give you plenty of notice so you could prepare, whatever you decide." After hanging up, Victoria found herself staring at Danny with new awareness. Meeting his German grandparents would be his first real introduction to the complexity of his family history. Until now, the photographs and German children's books had been abstract concepts. Having Klaus and Ingrid physically present would make Greta's side of his family real in a way Victoria wasn't sure she was ready for. "What do you think, buddy? she asked Danny, who looked up from his blocks with the serious expression he wore when considering important matters. "Up," Danny declared, raising his arms toward Victoria. It was one of his clearest words, and he used it to request everything from being picked up to wanting his toys placed on higher surfaces. Victoria lifted him into her lap, breathing in the familiar scent of his baby shampoo and the faint sweetness that seemed to cling to all toddlers. "Should we meet your other grandparents, the ones who live far away?" Danny responded by pressing his face against her neck in his version of a hug, then wiggling to get down so he could return to his blocks. Victoria took this as either enthusiastic approval or complete indifference to the momentous decision she was contemplating. That evening, after Danny was asleep, Victoria called Rachel to discuss her feelings about the upcoming visit. "I think it's wonderful," Rachel said immediately. "Danny's old enough now to start understanding that he has family in different places, but young enough that he won't overthink it. And honestly, Victoria, you've been corresponding with them for months. If you were going to have concerns about their intentions, wouldn't they have surfaced by now?" "It's not their intentions I'm worried about," Victoria admitted. "It's my own feelings. What if meeting them makes me feel like less of Danny's mother? What if he bonds with them immediately, and I feel left out of that connection?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. "Do you remember when the twins first met Tom's parents? I was so worried they would love Grandma Carol more than me because she spoiled them and didn't have to enforce bedtime rules. But you know what happened? Their relationship with her made them appreciate me more, not less. They learned that different people could love them in different ways." Victoria knew Rachel was right, but the fear persisted. She had worked so hard to become Danny's mother completely, to create a secure foundation for their relationship. The idea of introducing variables that might shift the dynamic felt risky. Over the next few days, Victoria found herself observing Danny with new attention, trying to imagine how Klaus and Ingrid would see him. Would they recognize Greta in his expressions? Would they be surprised by his personality, his American mannerisms, his obvious attachment to Victoria? Danny, meanwhile, continued to develop at his own remarkable pace. He had recently learned to say "mama" with clear intention, and each time he used the word, Victoria felt a surge of joy that never seemed to diminish. He was also beginning to show preferences for certain activities and toys that seemed to reveal aspects of his personality. He loved music and would dance enthusiastically to any rhythm. He was fascinated by mechanical objects and would spend long periods examining how things worked, and he showed an unusual patience for puzzles and sorting games. "He's definitely going to be an engineer," Victoria told Dr. Torres during Danny's 18-month checkup. "Or maybe a musician-engineer. Is that a thing?" "With Danny, anything seems possible," Dr. Torres replied, watching him methodically explore the various toys in her examination room. "He has the kind of focused curiosity that leads to innovation. You're raising a future problem solver." Dr. Torres also expressed enthusiasm about the upcoming visit from Danny's German grandparents. "Meeting extended family is almost always beneficial for children," she said. "It gives them a sense of belonging to something larger than their immediate household. And at Danny's age, he'll adapt to new people easily, as long as you're comfortable with the situation." "That's the key, isn't it?" Victoria mused. "My comfort level. If I'm anxious, he'll pick up on that." "Exactly. But Victoria, from what you've told me about your correspondence with the Mullers, they sound like thoughtful, respectful people who understand their role in Danny's life. Trust your instincts. They've served you well so far." The following week, Victoria made her decision. She called Klaus and Ingrid to tell them that October would be perfect for their visit, and she could hear the joy in their voices as they began. "Making plans. We are so grateful," Ingrid said, her English careful but warm. "We promise to follow your lead in everything. This is your home, and Daniel is your son. We are just honored to be included." As September progressed, Victoria found herself preparing for the visit in ways both practical and emotional. She researched German customs, bought a German-English dictionary, and even attempted to learn a few basic phrases that might make Klaus and Ingrid feel welcome. She also began talking to Danny about his upcoming visitors, showing him photographs, and explaining that these were special people who had loved his first mama, Greta. Danny repeated carefully, pointing at a photograph of his birth mother. He couldn't quite pronounce the name correctly, but Victoria could tell he was beginning to associate the image with something important. "That's right, sweetheart. And these are her mama and papa," Victoria said, showing him the most recent photograph Klaus and Ingrid had sent. "They're coming to visit us soon." Danny studied the photographs with his usual intense concentration, then surprised Victoria by attempting to say Oma, the German word for grandmother that Victoria had been practicing with him. "Very good," Victoria exclaimed. "Oma Ingrid will be so happy to hear you say that." The week before Klaus and Ingrid's arrival, Victoria found herself experiencing a range of emotions she hadn't anticipated. Excitement about Danny meeting his grandparents, mixed with anxiety about how the visit would affect their established routines. Pride in Danny's development, combined with worry about whether she had prepared him adequately for this significant experience. But perhaps most surprisingly, Victoria realized she was looking forward to sharing Danny's daily life with people who would appreciate him as much as she did. Klaus and Ingrid's love for Danny was clear in every letter, every video, call, every carefully chosen gift they had sent. Having them witness Danny's personality firsthand felt like giving them a precious gift. The morning of their arrival, Victoria woke early to find Danny already awake in his crib, babbling to his stuffed animals in what sounded like a complex narrative involving his toy trucks and a stuffed elephant Klaus and Ingrid had sent him. "Big day today, buddy," Victoria said as she lifted him out of his crib. "Are you ready to meet Oma and Opa?" Danny responded with excited bouncing and his attempt at saying Oma, which had improved considerably over the past week. Victoria had planned every detail of their first meeting carefully. She would pick Klaus and Ingrid up at the airport while Danny stayed with Rachel, giving the grandparents time to settle into their hotel and adjust to the time change before meeting Danny in the familiar environment of Victoria's apartment. At the airport, Victoria found herself scanning the international arrivals area with nervous energy. When she finally spotted Klaus and Ingrid emerging from customs, a silver-haired couple who looked exactly like their photographs but somehow more substantial in person, her nervousness transformed into genuine warmth. "Victoria," Ingrid called out, her face lighting up with recognition and joy. The embrace that followed felt natural and welcoming, as if they were reuniting after a long separation, rather than meeting for the first time. Klaus was tall and gentle-spoken, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Ingrid was petite and energetic, with laugh lines that suggested a lifetime of finding joy in small moments. "We cannot thank you enough for this opportunity," Klaus said as they walked toward Victoria's car. "To see where Daniel lives, to meet the woman who has become his mother, this means everything to us." "I'm nervous," Victoria admitted as they drove through Chicago traffic toward their hotel. "I want this to go well for everyone, especially for Danny." "Of course you are nervous," Ingrid said from the back seat. "This is a big step for all of us. But Victoria, from your letters and our video calls, we can see that Daniel is happy and secure. That is all any parent wants for their child." After settling Klaus and Ingrid into their hotel and giving them time to rest, Victoria returned home to prepare Danny for the meeting. She had decided to keep things simple. Klaus and Ingrid would come to the apartment for dinner, giving them time to interact with Danny in his most comfortable environment. Oma and Opa are coming to visit, Victoria told Danny as she gave him his afternoon snack. They're going to love meeting you. Danny looked up from his carefully arranged pieces of cut fruit and said, Oma, with obvious pride in his pronunciation. When the doorbell rang at 5 o'clock, Victoria took a deep breath and opened the door to find Klaus and Ingrid standing in the hallway with expressions of barely contained excitement and what looked like enough gifts to fill Danny's entire nursery. We may have gone a little overboard with the presents, Klaus admitted sheepishly. Ingrid has been shopping for our grandson for months. Victoria led them into the living room where Danny was playing with his blocks. For a moment, everyone was quiet, taking in the significance of the moment. Then Danny looked up, saw the visitors, and did something that took Victoria's breath away. He smiled, pushed himself to standing, and toddled directly toward Klaus and Ingrid with his arms outstretched. Oh, Ingrid breathed, tears streaming down her face as she knelt to Danny's level. Oh, mein kleiner Schatz. Danny allowed himself to be embraced by his grandmother, then turned his attention to Klaus with the same fearless curiosity he applied to everything new in his environment. He knows us, Klaus said wonderingly. Somehow he knows us. Victoria watched the interaction with a mixture of joy and amazement. Danny was being himself completely, charming, confident, interested in these new people who clearly adored him. There was no shyness, no clinging to Victoria for reassurance. Instead, he seemed to understand instinctively that Klaus and Ingrid were safe, that they belonged in his expanding world. Would you like to see his room? Victoria offered, after Danny had thoroughly investigated all the presents and pronounced them satisfactory by attempting to stack them into towers. In Danny's nursery, Klaus and Ingrid examined every detail with the intensity of people trying to memorize something precious. They admired the photographs Victoria had displayed, the carefully organized toys, the little chair by the window where she read to Danny every night. It is perfect, Ingrid said softly. You have created such a loving home for him. Look, Klaus said, pointing to a framed photograph on Danny's dresser. You included Greta. Victoria had placed a beautiful photograph of Greta holding newborn Danny in a place of honor among the other family pictures. I want him to know about his first. Mama, Victoria said, she'll always be part of his story. That evening, as they shared dinner and watched Danny charm his grandparents with his developing vocabulary and his determination to feed himself independently, Victoria realized her fears had been unfounded. Klaus and Ingrid's presence didn't diminish her role as Danny's mother. It enhanced it. They were witness to the beautiful child she had raised, the secure attachment she had fostered, the loving home she had created. Tomorrow, Ingrid said as they prepared to leave, perhaps we could take Daniel to the park. In Germany we have a saying, Kinder brauchen Wurzeln und Flügel. Children need roots and wings. You have given him such strong roots, Victoria. Now we hope to help him understand that his wings can carry him anywhere in the world, because he is loved in many places. As Victoria tucked Danny into his crib that night, she reflected on how perfectly Ingrid's words captured what she hoped. To give Danny the security of belonging completely to their small family, combined with the confidence that came from knowing he was part of something larger, something that stretched across oceans and connected him to people and places he had yet to discover. What did you think of Oma and Opa? Victoria asked Danny as he settled into sleep. Danny's response was to smile sleepily and say, Oma, one more time before closing his eyes. And Victoria knew that their family had just grown in the most beautiful way possible. The week with Klaus and Ingrid unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between past and present, old traditions and new beginnings. Each morning brought discoveries that enriched Danny's understanding of his heritage, while strengthening the bonds Victoria had never quite dared to hope for. On their third day together, Ingrid arrived at Victoria's apartment carrying a worn leather satchel that looked like it had travelled across decades as well as continents. "I brought something special," she announced, settling onto the living room floor where Danny was building an elaborate city with his blocks. "These are Greta's, baby things that we saved all these years." Victoria watched as Ingrid carefully unpacked treasures that spoke of a childhood lived in a different time and place. A hand-carved wooden rattle that had been Greta's father's when he was a baby. Tiny lederhosen that Greta had worn to her. First Oktoberfest, a music box that played Brahms' Lullaby and still worked perfectly after 40 years. Danny was immediately fascinated by the music box, turning it over in his hands with the methodical examination he applied to anything mechanical. When the melody began playing, he sat perfectly still, listening with an intensity that made all the adults hold their breath. "Greta loved music," Klaus said quietly. "She could play piano, violin, and guitar. We wondered if Daniel might inherit that gift." As if responding to his grandfather's words, Danny began swaying gently to the melody, his little body moving in perfect time with the rhythm. When the music stopped, he looked up at Klaus with an expression that seemed to ask for more. "I think he did inherit it," Victoria said softly, winding the music box again. That afternoon, Klaus suggested they visit the Lincoln Park Zoo, a place Victoria had taken Danny countless times, but which felt entirely new through his grandparents' eyes. Klaus had been a biology teacher before retirement, and he turned their zoo visit into an impromptu nature lesson, teaching Danny the German names for animals and making the sounds each one made. "Elephant," Klaus said, pointing to the elephant exhibit. "Can you say elephant, Daniel?" "Elephant," Danny attempted, clapping his hands with delight when the elephant trumpeted as if responding to his pronunciation. Victoria found herself learning German words alongside Danny, discovering that bear meant bear and Af meant monkey. But more than the language lessons, she was struck by how naturally Klaus and Ingrid fit into Danny's world, how they seemed to understand his rhythms and interests without any period of adjustment. "You are very good with children," Victoria told Ingrid as they watched Klaus help Danny feed lettuce to the goats in the petting zoo. "We had practice," Ingrid replied with a smile. "3 children of our own, and now 4 grandchildren in Germany. But Daniel is special. He has this quality of presence, this way of being completely engaged with whatever he is experiencing. I think that comes from feeling very secure in his world." That evening, Ingrid prepared a traditional German dinner in Victoria's kitchen, teaching her to make schnitzel and spätzle, while Danny played at their feet with the wooden toys Klaus had brought from Germany. "Cooking is how we show love in German families," Ingrid explained, as she demonstrated the proper technique for pounding the meat thin. "Food connects us to our heritage, to memories of home." Victoria realized this was the first time she had cooked a meal that connected Danny to his German roots, and she felt a responsibility to learn these recipes so she could continue the tradition after Klaus and Ingrid returned home. "Will you write down the recipes for me?" Victoria asked. "I want Danny to grow up knowing these flavors, these connections to Greta's family." Ingrid's eyes filled with tears. "Of course. And Victoria, perhaps someday you and Daniel could visit us in Germany. We would love to show him where his mother grew up, the house where she lived, the school where she learned to play violin." The possibility of taking Danny to Germany had never occurred to Victoria, but as Ingrid spoke, she could envision it. Danny playing in the same gardens where Greta had played, hearing German spoken all around him, understanding his heritage not just intellectually, but experientially. "I would like that very much," Victoria said, surprised by how much she meant it. On their 5th day together, Klaus and Ingrid suggested something that initially made Victoria nervous. They wanted to take Danny to a German cultural center on the north side of Chicago, where there was a children's program featuring traditional music and storytelling. It might be too stimulating for him, Victoria worried. He's never been in a room with that many people speaking German. But Klaus and Ingrid's confidence was reassuring, and Victoria found herself trusting their judgment about what would be appropriate for Danny. The cultural center turned out to be a revelation. Danny was fascinated by the accordion music, mesmerized by the storyteller who acted out fairy tales with elaborate gestures, and completely enchanted by the other children who were learning traditional German dances. He fits right in, an elderly woman told Victoria in accented English. Is this his first time here? Yes, Victoria replied, watching Danny attempt to copy the simple folk dance steps the other children were learning. His grandparents brought us. The grandparents from Germany. Klaus and Ingrid told us they were visiting their grandson. Such a special thing, to keep the connections alive across the ocean. Victoria realized that Klaus and Ingrid had been talking about Danny to the German community in Chicago, proudly claiming him as their grandson, despite the complex circumstances of his adoption. Their love for him was so natural, so unconditional, that they spoke of him to strangers with the same pride biological grandparents might show. That night, after Klaus and Ingrid had returned to their hotel, Victoria found herself looking through the photo albums they had brought, studying pictures of Greta at every stage of her life. There was Greta as a toddler, bearing an unmistakable resemblance to Danny. Greta as a schoolgirl, serious and studious. Greta as a young woman, laughing, with friends, traveling through Europe, eventually meeting Marcus during his deployment. She was beautiful, Victoria said to herself, touching a photograph of Greta holding baby Danny in the hospital. She would have been such a good mother. For the first time since the adoption, Victoria allowed herself to fully grieve for the woman Danny would never know, the mother-son relationship that had been cut short by tragedy. But alongside the sadness, she felt profound gratitude for Klaus and Ingrid's presence in Danny's life, their determination to keep Greta's memory alive for him. On their last full day together, Klaus and Ingrid insisted on cooking one final meal. A celebration dinner that would become, they hoped, an annual tradition. Next year, perhaps we come for Christmas, Ingrid suggested as she prepared Danny's favorite dish from the week, the simple egg noodles with butter and herbs that he had pronounced good with obvious satisfaction. Or perhaps you visit us in Germany next summer, Klaus added. Daniel would love the countryside, and there is a children's music festival in our town that happens every July. Victoria felt her world expanding in real time, plans and possibilities stretching into a future that included regular visits, cultural exchanges, and Danny growing up bilingual and bicultural. I want him to know both sides of his heritage, Victoria said as they sat down to dinner. American and German, Marcus's military family traditions, and Greta's cultural roots. I want him to understand that he belongs to all of it. Klaus raised his glass of wine in a toast. To Daniel, he said, may he grow up knowing he is loved in many languages, in many countries, by many people who want only his happiness. To Daniel, Victoria and Ingrid echoed, and Danny, perhaps sensing the solemnity of the moment, clapped his hands and said, Prost! The German toast Klaus had been teaching him all week. As they prepared for Klaus and Ingrid's departure the next morning, Victoria realized how much her understanding of family had evolved over the course of their visit. She had started the week worried about protecting her role as Danny's mother, and she was ending it grateful for the ways his grandparents had enhanced rather than threatened that role. You will call us every week? Ingrid asked as they packed, the last of their gifts into suitcases that seemed impossibly small for all the memories they were taking home. Every week, Victoria promised. And I'll send videos of everything. His first words in German, his progress with the music box, all his developments. And you will seriously consider visiting us next summer, Klaus added hopefully. Victoria looked at Danny, who was playing contentedly with his new wooden train set, occasionally saying Opa to the toy conductor figure Klaus had given him. Yes, she said, surprising herself with how definitive her answer. It was. I want Danny to see where his mother grew up. I want him to understand that home can be more than one place. As they stood in the airport terminal saying their goodbyes, Victoria felt none of the finality she had experienced when Sarah left 2 years ago. This was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a relationship that would enrich Danny's entire life. Thank you, Ingrid whispered as she hugged Victoria one last time. Thank you for raising our grandson with so much love, and thank you for sharing him with us. Thank you for showing me that love multiplies when it's shared, Victoria replied. Danny is lucky to have you in his life. Danny waved enthusiastically as his grandparents disappeared through security, calling out, "Bye-bye, Oma! Bye-bye, Opa!" with the casual confidence of a child who understood that some goodbyes were temporary, that some connections transcended physical distance. On the drive home, Victoria found herself already planning their next visit, already imagining the photographs she would send Klaus and Ingrid, already looking forward to the weekly video calls that would keep Danny connected to his German heritage. "What did you think of your grandparents?" she asked Danny as they pulled into their parking garage. "Oma," Danny said happily, then launched into a stream of babbling that seemed to include attempts at several German words he had learned throughout the week. Victoria realized that Danny's first real introduction to his complex family history had been not just successful, but transformative for all of them. He now had grandparents who would watch him grow up from across the ocean, who would cheer his accomplishments and send birthday presents and teach him songs in their native language. More importantly, he had living proof that he was wanted and loved by people who had known his birth parents, who could tell him stories about Greta's childhood and help him understand the heritage that flowed through his veins alongside the love Victoria gave him every day. 5 years had passed since that stormy night when Sarah appeared at Victoria's door, and Danny's 7th birthday dawned with the crisp clarity that comes with autumn in Chicago. Victoria woke to find him already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table, carefully arranging his birthday gifts from Germany alongside the presents she had wrapped the night before. "Oma Ingrid sent my favorite cookies," Danny announced, holding up a tin decorated with alpine scenes. His German pronunciation had become flawless during their annual summer visits to Munich, and he switched between English and German with the fluid ease of a truly bilingual child. Victoria marveled at the confident boy he had become, tall for his age, with Greta's expressive eyes and Marcus's determined chin. Danny possessed a natural leadership quality that teachers consistently praised. He was the child other kids sought out on the playground, the one who could mediate disputes and organize elaborate games that included everyone. "What do you want to do first today?" Victoria asked, pouring coffee for herself and orange juice for Danny. Their tradition was that birthday children chose every activity from breakfast to bedtime story. "Can we visit Dad's grave?" Danny asked. "I want to tell him about my violin." "Recital next week." Victoria's heart squeezed with the familiar mixture of pride and sadness that came with Danny's matter-of-fact references to Marcus. 3 years ago, when Danny had started asking detailed questions about his first parents, Victoria had begun taking him to the military cemetery where Marcus was buried. These visits had become routine, meaningful conversations where Danny would share his achievements and ask questions about the father he had never known. "Of course we can," Victoria said. "Should we bring some of those German cookies to share with him?" Danny nodded seriously. "Dad would like to know I can make Spätzle now. Opa Klaus taught me the secret technique. At the cemetery, Danny settled cross-legged beside Marcus's headstone with the comfortable familiarity of a child who had never been taught to fear death, only to respect the memory of those who had loved him. "Hi, Dad," he said conversationally. "I'm 7 today. I learned to play Für Elise on violin, and Mama says you would be proud because it was one of Greta's favorite pieces." Victoria listened as Danny chatted about school, his friends, his upcoming violin recital, and his plans to join the school soccer team. He had never seemed to doubt that Marcus could hear him, and Victoria had learned not to question the comfort these one-sided conversations provided. "Mama," Danny said as they walked back to the car, "do you think Sarah ever thinks about my birthday?" The question caught Victoria off guard. Danny knew Sarah's story, how she had brought him to Victoria, how she had made the difficult decision to step away so he could have a stable home, but he rarely asked about her directly. "I think she probably does," Victoria answered honestly. "Sarah loved you very much. That's why she made sure you ended up where you needed to be." "Do you think I'll ever meet her again?" Victoria had been dreading this question for years, knowing it would come as Danny grew older and more curious about his origins. "Would you like to meet her?" Danny considered this seriously. "Maybe someday. Not because I need another mom." He added quickly, with the sensitivity that made Victoria's heart ache with love, "You're my mom, but maybe just to say thank you." That afternoon, Victoria found herself making a decision she had been avoiding for years. While Danny played violin in his room, his daily practice that had become as routine as brushing his teeth, she opened her laptop and began searching for Sarah Martinez. It took less than an hour to find her. Sarah was living in San Diego, working as a substance abuse counselor, and had been featured in a local news article about successful recovery programs. The photograph showed a woman Victoria barely recognized, healthy, confident, with clear eyes and a genuine smile as she hugged a group of program graduates. Victoria stared at the screen for a long time, processing the evidence of Sarah's transformation. The woman in this photograph bore little resemblance to the desperate, broken person who had arrived at Victoria's door with a baby and a storm of grief. "You found her, didn't you?" Danny said from the doorway. Victoria hadn't heard him stop practicing. "How did you know?" "You get a certain look when you're thinking about serious things," Danny replied, settling beside her at the kitchen table. "Is she okay?" Victoria turned the laptop so Danny could see the article. "She looks happy. She's helping other people now, people who are struggling like she was." Danny studied the photograph with intense concentration. "She has kind eyes. I always wondered what she looked like now." "Do you want me to contact her?" Victoria asked, her heart racing with the implications of what she was offering. Danny was quiet for several minutes, his face reflecting the serious consideration he gave to all important decisions. "Could you write her a letter? Not asking to meet or anything, just letting her know I'm okay? And maybe telling her that I understand why she made the choice she did?" Victoria felt tears building behind her eyes. "I think that's a very mature and thoughtful idea." That evening, while Danny played with friends from the neighborhood, Victoria drafted a letter she had never imagined writing. "Dear Sarah, I hope this letter finds you well and happy. Today is Danny's 7th birthday, and he asked about you, which prompted me to look you up online. I was so moved to see the work you're doing and the life you've built for yourself. I wanted you to know that Danny is thriving. He's a remarkable child, curious, kind, confident, and gifted in ways that surprise me daily. He plays violin, speaks German fluently thanks to his grandparents in Munich, and has the kind of natural leadership abilities that suggest he'll make a real difference in the world. More importantly, he understands his story. He knows about the difficult decision you made 7 years ago, and he wants you to know that he's grateful, not just for bringing him to me, but for loving him enough to put his needs before your own desires. He asked if I would tell you that. He's okay, that he's loved, and that he understands why you made the choice you did. He also said that maybe someday when he's older he'd like to meet you just to say thank you. I want you to know that your decision changed both our lives for the better. Danny has given me a purpose and joy I never knew was possible. And seeing your recovery and the work you're doing now makes me believe that letting him go allowed you to become the person you were meant to be. Thank you for trusting me with the most precious gift imaginable. With gratitude and warm wishes, Victoria P.S. Danny wants you to know he can make German pancakes and has learned to whistle, 2 accomplishments he's particularly proud of this year. Victoria read the letter 3 times before sealing it in an envelope addressed to the counseling center where Sarah worked. The act of writing it had felt like closing a circle that had been open for 7 years. 2 weeks later, Victoria's phone rang with a California number she didn't recognize. Victoria? This is Sarah. I got your letter. The voice was the same, but everything else about Sarah seemed different, stronger, steadier, filled with a peace that Victoria had never heard before. Sarah, Victoria breathed. I wasn't sure you'd call. I've been crying for 2 days, Sarah said with a laugh that held no bitterness. Happy tears. Victoria, thank you for raising him so beautifully. The child you described in your letter is everything Marcus and Greta would have wanted him to become. They talked for over an hour, sharing stories about Danny's development, Sarah's recovery journey, and the unexpected ways their separate paths had led them both to places of contentment. I don't want to complicate his life, Sarah said near the end of their conversation. But maybe someday when he's ready we could meet, not as mother and son. You're his mother in every way that matters, but as 2 people whose lives intersected at exactly the right moment. I think he'd like that, Victoria replied, when he's older, when he can process the complexity of it all. After hanging up, Victoria found Danny in his room, reading one of the German fairy tale books Klaus and Ingrid had sent for his birthday. That was Sarah, wasn't it? He asked without looking up from his book. How did you know? You sound different. When you talk to people who knew me before you did. Softer, maybe, like you're sharing something precious. Victoria sat on the edge of his bed, marveling once again at his emotional intelligence. She wanted you to know that she's proud of the person you're becoming, and she said maybe someday, when you're ready, you could meet. Danny closed his book and looked at Victoria with the serious expression that meant he was processing something. Important. Will you always be my real mom, even if I meet other people who are connected to my story? Always, Victoria said without hesitation. Being someone's mother isn't about biology or who was there first. It's about showing up every day, making choices based on love, and helping someone become the best version of themselves. That's what we've been doing together for 7 years. Danny nodded, satisfied with her answer. Then maybe someday I'd like to meet her, and maybe I could tell her about violin, and how I can make Oma's cookies now, and how you taught me to ride a bike in Lincoln Park. That night, as Victoria tucked Danny into bed, surrounded by birthday presents and cards from friends and family, scattered across 3 continents, she reflected on the unexpected shape their life had taken. 7 years ago, she had opened her door to a storm and found her destiny. What she hadn't expected was how that single act of love would create ripples that touched so many lives. Sarah's recovery, Klaus and Ingrid's renewed sense of purpose as grandparents, the countless children Danny would undoubtedly influence, as he grew into the leader he was becoming. Sweet dreams, my love, Victoria whispered, kissing Danny's forehead. Mama, Danny said sleepily, do you ever wish things had happened differently? that I had come to you in a normal way? Victoria considered the question, thinking about the path that had brought them together. Marcus's sacrifice, Greta's love, Sarah's courage, the storm that had seemed like chaos but had actually been the universe conspiring to create their family. Never, she said firmly. Our story is perfect exactly as it happened. All the love that brought you to me, all the people who chose to put your happiness first. That's not normal, sweetheart. That's magic. Danny smiled and closed his eyes, and Victoria stood in his doorway for a long moment, listening to his peaceful breathing and feeling grateful for every choice that had led them to this moment. Outside, Chicago hummed with its usual evening energy, but inside their home, everything was exactly as it should be, a mother and son, bound not by biology but by choice, surrounded by love that stretched across oceans and connected them to a family that had been built one act of courage at a time. In the end, Victoria realized family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you created. One decision at a time, one moment of love at a time, one choice to put someone else's happiness before your own convenience. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that choice would transform not just one life, but many lives, creating ripples of love that would last for generations. Danny had been right to ask her to trust the storm that brought him to her door. It had brought them both exactly where they needed to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.